William Shatner is one of the most iconic figures in entertainment history. The original Captain Kirk, who defined Star Trek and became synonymous with the very concept of boldly going where no one has gone before. At almost 96 years old, Shatner remains active, still working, still appearing at conventions, still engaging with fans and the public. But behind the energetic facade and the defiant refusal to slow down lies a profoundly sad reality about how William Shatner actually lives his final years. This is a man haunted by destroyed friendships, devastating personal tragedies, decades of regrets, the inescapable loneliness of outliving almost everyone who mattered in his life, and a relentless work schedule that seems less like passion and more like desperate avoidance of sitting still long enough to confront what his life has actually been. Understanding the sadness of Shatner's current existence requires examining the relationships he destroyed and never repaired, the personal tragedies that scarred him, the isolation that comes from being one of the last survivors of his generation, his complicated relationship with the franchise that made him famous, and the questions about why a man approaching 96 is still working frantically rather than enjoying retirement. This is the story of a man who achieved everything but lost what mattered most along the way. The most devastating aspect of Shatner's life is the state of his friendships with his Star Trek castmates, particularly the relationship with Leonard Nimoy that ended in estrangement and was never reconciled before Nimoy's death in 2015. Shatner and Nimoy worked together for decades, playing Kirk and Spock in a partnership that defined one of entertainment's greatest friendships on screen. But off-screen, their relationship deteriorated over the years until Nimoy cut off contact with Shatner entirely, refusing to speak to him, and reportedly telling Shatner's representatives that he wanted nothing to do with him. The reasons for the estrangement are complicated and disputed, but center around Shatner's behavior over decades of working together and his actions after the original series ended. According to multiple sources and accounts from other cast members, Shatner was difficult to work with during the original series, often treating his castmates as supporting players rather than equals, demanding rewrites to give himself more screen time, and generally behaving with the ego and self-centeredness of a leading man who saw everyone else as less important. Nimoy tolerated this for years, maintaining professional courtesy and even friendship during the making of the original series and the early films. But the relationship fractured over time, with particular damage coming from what Nimoy perceived as Shatner's exploitation of their friendship for commercial purposes. Shatner wrote multiple books about Star Trek that included stories and details about Nimoy and their relationship, and Nimoy reportedly felt that Shatner was profiting from their connection without adequately compensating or even consulting him about what was being shared publicly. The final break came in the years before Nimoy's death. According to reports, Nimoy simply stopped responding to Shatner's attempts at contact. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations were declined, messages were ignored. Shatner has spoken publicly about his pain and confusion over Nimoy's rejection, claiming he doesn't understand what he did that was so unforgivable, asking why his old friend won't speak to him. But Nimoy apparently felt that Shatner's behavior over decades had made continuing the friendship impossible, and he chose to cut ties rather than maintain a relationship that had become toxic or painful. Nimoy died in February 2015, without ever reconciling with Shatner. Shatner has admitted in interviews that this is one of the great regrets and sources of pain in his life, that he wishes he'd understood what was wrong and fixed it while there was still time, that he would give anything for one more conversation with Leonard to clear the air. But that opportunity is gone forever. Nimoy is dead. The friendship died unreconciled, and Shatner is left carrying the weight of a relationship destroyed that he apparently still doesn't fully understand. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Kirk and Spock's friendship meant so much to millions of fans, represented such a powerful bond of loyalty and understanding, while the actors who played them couldn't maintain that friendship in real life. Shatner embodied the captain who valued friendship above all, who risked everything for his crew, who believed in loyalty and connection, but he couldn't preserve his most important real-world friendship. Shatner's relationship with other original series cast members has been similarly damaged. James Doohan, who played Scotty, despised Shatner for decades before his death in 2005. According to multiple accounts, Doohan felt that Shatner was selfish and disrespectful, that he treated the supporting cast as beneath him, and that he never showed appropriate gratitude or respect for the people who helped make Star Trek successful. Doohan's family asked Shatner not to attend his funeral, a devastating public rejection that made clear just how much Doohan had come to hate him. George Takei, who played Sulu, has been publicly critical of Shatner for years, describing him as difficult, egotistical, and someone who made working on Star Trek less enjoyable than it should have been. Their feud has played out in interviews, social media exchanges, and public appearances where both men have taken shots at each other. While there's clearly animosity on both sides, and Takei bears some responsibility for keeping the conflict alive, the underlying complaint is consistent with what others have said, that Shatner was more concerned with his own prominence than with the ensemble that made the show work. Walter Koenig, who played Chekhov, has been more diplomatic but has also indicated that working with Shatner was challenging and that the leading man's ego created tensions on set. Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura before her death in 2022, had a more positive relationship with Shatner, but even she made comments over the years suggesting he could be difficult and self-centered. The pattern is unmistakable. Multiple cast members from the show that made Shatner famous have described him as difficult, egotistical, and someone who damaged relationships through his behavior. And while Shatner has defenders, and while relationships are always complicated with fault on multiple sides, the fact remains that at almost 96, Shatner is largely estranged from or has damaged relationships with most of the people he worked most closely with during the most important project of his career. Shatner's personal life has been marked by tragedy and loss that would break many people. He's been married 4 times, with 3 marriages ending in divorce and 1 ending in the drowning death of his wife in their swimming pool. Each failed marriage represents dreams that didn't work out, partnerships that collapsed, families that were disrupted or damaged. But the most devastating personal tragedy was the death of his 3rd wife, Noreen Kidd, in 1999. Shatner found Noreen dead in their swimming pool, having drowned after what was determined to be an accidental fall while intoxicated. The circumstances were traumatic. Shatner came home to find his wife's body floating in the pool, a nightmarish discovery that haunted him for years afterward. Noreen had struggled with alcoholism throughout their marriage, a battle that Shatner has spoken about publicly. He's described trying to help her, watching her struggle with addiction, feeling helpless as she couldn't overcome her demons despite treatment and support. Their marriage was troubled by her drinking, marked by the chaos and pain that addiction brings to relationships. But Shatner loved her, stayed with her, and then had to process the trauma of finding her dead in circumstances that could possibly have been prevented if different choices had been made. Shatner has spoken about the guilt he carries regarding Noreen's death, the questions about whether he could have done more, whether he should have seen it coming, whether different actions might have saved her. He's described the nightmares and flashbacks, the image of her body in the pool that he can't forget, the trauma of that discovery that marked him permanently. Shatner's current marriage to Elizabeth Martin, whom he married in 2001, also ended in divorce in 2020 after nearly 2 decades together. At 89 years old, Shatner went through another divorce, another failed attempt at lasting partnership, another ending to a relationship he'd hoped would be permanent. The details of why the marriage ended haven't been made fully public, but the fact of it ending represents another loss, another failure, another piece of evidence that Shatner has struggled throughout his life to maintain successful, intimate relationships. Shatner has 3 daughters from his first marriage to Gloria Rand, Leslie, Elizabeth, and Melanie. His relationship with his daughters has been complicated, marked by his absences during their childhood due to his career demands, by the chaos of his personal life and multiple marriages, and by the challenges of being William Shatner's child rather than just having a father. Shatner has admitted in interviews that he wasn't a great father during his daughter's formative years, that he was often away working, that he prioritized his career over his family in ways he regrets. He's spoken about missing important moments in his daughters' lives, about not being present emotionally, even when he was physically there, about the damage his divorces and subsequent marriages did to his relationships with his children. The loneliness of Shatner's current life is profound and inescapable. At almost 96 years old, he's outlived almost everyone who was important to him throughout his career and personal life. Leonard Nimoy is dead. James Doohan is dead. DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy and was one of Shatner's closer friends from the cast, died in 1999. Nichelle Nichols died in 2022. The vast majority of people Shatner worked with on the original series are gone. Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek's creator, who gave Shatner the role that defined his career, died in 1991. The directors and producers and writers who helped create the original series are largely dead. Shatner's contemporaries from his early acting career in Canada and on Broadway are dead. His first wife, Gloria, died in 2021. Noreen drowned in 1999. He's divorced from his most recent wife, Elizabeth. This means that Shatner lives in a world where almost no one from his past remains alive and accessible. The people who knew him when he was young, who worked with him on his greatest achievements, who shared his journey, are gone. Shatner is one of the last survivors of the original series era, and that survival comes with profound isolation. He's spoken in interviews about the loneliness of being one of the few left, about going to memorial services with depressing frequency, about the surreal experience of being the only person in a room who remembers certain events or people because everyone else who was there is dead. He's described feeling like a ghost, still alive in a world where most of his generation has passed on, surrounded by people who know him only as Captain Kirk rather than as Bill Shatner, who had dreams and struggles and friendships before he became famous. The estrangement from his original series castmates compounds this loneliness because even the few survivors from that era aren't available to him for connection or reminiscence. George Takei won't speak positively about him. Walter Koenig maintains professional distance. The friendships that should have sustained him through these final years either never existed in the forms he thought they did or were destroyed by his own behavior decades ago. Shatner's relationship with Star Trek itself is complicated and has evolved over his lifetime in ways that reflect his struggles with identity, ego, and legacy. In the years immediately following the original series cancellation in 1969, Shatner was frustrated and even bitter about Star Trek. The show had been canceled despite his best efforts, his career wasn't progressing the way he'd hoped, and he struggled with being typecast as Captain Kirk when he wanted to be recognized as a serious actor with range. Throughout the 1970s, Shatner took roles in television, theater, and film, trying to prove he was more than just Kirk. But nothing else reached the cultural significance or audience connection that Star Trek had achieved. When Star Trek the Motion Picture was greenlit in the late 70s, Shatner returned to the role, and the subsequent films from 1979 through 1994 represented his primary sustained success during that period. But Shatner's ego and his need to be the center of attention created problems during the film era as well. He reportedly pushed for rewrites to give Kirk more prominence, resented when other characters got significant storylines, and lobbied for the death of Kirk in Star Trek Generations to ensure the character got a dramatic ending rather than just fading away. Kirk's death in Generations was controversial among fans, with many feeling it was anticlimactic and unworthy of the character, but Shatner got the dramatic death scene he wanted. In recent decades, Shatner has fully embraced his Captain Kirk legacy, attending conventions, signing autographs, writing books about Star Trek, and generally profiting from his association with the franchise. But there's something sad about watching a man approaching 96 still selling his connection to a role he played over 50 years ago, still appearing at conventions to sign autographs for fans who love Captain Kirk more than they could ever know William Shatner. Shatner has been critical of modern Star Trek, particularly Discovery and the newer series, arguing that they don't understand what made the original series special and that they've lost the optimism and exploration that defined Trek. His criticism mirrors what many longtime fans feel, but it also positions him as the guardian of true Star Trek, the person who understands it better than the current creators. Whether this criticism comes from genuine concern for the franchise or from ego and possessiveness is unclear, but it's another example of Shatner's inability to let go and move on from the role and show that defined him. Perhaps the saddest aspect of Shatner's current life is his relentless work schedule, despite being almost 96 years old. Shatner continues working at a pace that would exhaust people half his age, making appearances, recording podcasts, writing books, doing interviews, traveling to conventions, and generally maintaining a schedule that suggests someone desperate to avoid stopping. On the surface, this could be admirable. A man refusing to let age slow him down, staying active and engaged, rather than retiring to quiet decline. But when you look closer, it seems less like healthy activity, and more like desperate avoidance of sitting still long enough to confront his life, his regrets, his loneliness, and his mortality. Shatner has spoken about his fear of irrelevance, about the terror of being forgotten, about needing to stay visible and active to maintain his place in public consciousness. This suggests that his frantic work schedule isn't driven by passion or fulfillment, but by fear. Fear of obscurity, fear of sitting alone with his thoughts, fear of confronting the destroyed friendships and personal tragedies and regrets that fill his past. There's also the question of money. Despite a long and successful career, Shatner's financial situation has apparently been less secure than it should be, partly due to expensive divorces, partly due to lifestyle choices, partly due to how Hollywood compensation worked during his era. He's spoken about needing to work for financial reasons, about convention appearances and autograph sessions being significant income sources, about not being able to afford true retirement. This creates the sad spectacle of Captain Kirk, one of the most iconic characters in television history, signing autographs for money at conventions in his mid-90s because he can't afford to stop. It's a reminder of how Hollywood uses people up and how even successful actors from earlier eras can struggle financially in old age. Shatner went to space in October 2021 aboard Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket, becoming at 90 years old the oldest person to travel to space. The flight was arranged by Jeff Bezos and was positioned as a celebration of Shatner's iconic role as Captain Kirk finally getting to experience real space travel. But Shatner's emotional reaction to the experience was unexpectedly dark and sad. In the moments after landing, Shatner broke down crying and tried to describe to Bezos what he'd experienced. Not joy or wonder or excitement, but overwhelming grief and awareness of mortality. He spoke about seeing the Earth's fragile atmosphere, about the darkness of space, about the realization of death and emptiness. Bezos tried to celebrate with champagne, but Shatner was still processing the existential horror he'd experienced. The footage of Shatner trying to communicate his grief to a Bezos more interested in partying is genuinely sad. The old man confronting mortality while the billionaire pops bottles, the profound experience being treated as a publicity stunt. Shatner later elaborated in interviews that going to space made him aware of death in a way he'd never experienced before, that seeing the Earth from space emphasized how fragile and temporary everything is, that instead of feeling wonder, he felt grief for the dying planet and for his own approaching death. For a man approaching 96, this confrontation with mortality through the experience that should have been triumphant instead became another source of sadness and existential dread. At almost 96, Shatner carries a heavy burden of regrets that he's been increasingly candid about in recent years. He's expressed deep regret over his estrangement from Leonard Nimoy and his inability to repair that friendship before Nimoy died. He's spoken about wishing he'd been a better colleague to his castmates, about recognizing too late that his ego and self-centeredness damaged relationships that should have been cherished. He's admitted regret about his absences during his daughter's childhoods, about prioritizing career over family in ways that damaged those relationships permanently. He's spoken about wishing he'd been more present, more emotionally available, more focused on the people who needed him rather than on his career and his fame. Shatner has expressed regret about failed marriages, about Noreen's death and whether he could have done more to help her overcome her addiction, about the pattern of relationship failures that marked his personal life. He's wondered aloud in interviews whether something in him made lasting partnership impossible, whether his ego or his needs or his psychology prevented him from sustaining the intimacy that marriage requires. There's also regret about opportunities missed, about roles he didn't take or projects he passed on, about chances for different kinds of work that might have expanded his range beyond Captain Kirk. While Star Trek made him famous and wealthy, it also typecast him in ways that limited other opportunities, and Shatner seems to carry some regret about not breaking free from that typecasting more successfully. Most poignantly, Shatner has expressed regret about time itself, about the impossibility of going back and doing things differently, about understanding life's lessons too late to apply them when they mattered, about being old enough to see his mistakes clearly but too old to fix them. He's spoken about the cruelty of wisdom arriving in old age when there's no longer time to use it to build a different life. William Shatner's legacy as an actor is secure. Captain Kirk is one of the most iconic characters in television history, a role that will be remembered and celebrated long after Shatner is gone. He's achieved fame and success that most actors could only dream about. He's been part of a cultural phenomenon that changed science fiction and television, and he's left a mark on entertainment that's permanent. But when you look at how Shatner actually lives at almost 96 years old, it's profoundly sad. He's largely alone, estranged from or having damaged relationships with most of the people who were important in his life. His closest friend from Star Trek died without reconciling with him. Multiple castmates despised him. His marriages failed except for the one that ended with his wife drowning in their pool. His relationship with his daughters is complicated by his absences and failures as a father. He's working frantically at an age when most people have been retired for decades, driven apparently more by financial need and fear of irrelevance than by genuine passion. He went to space and came back crying about death instead of celebrating wonder. He carries regrets about destroyed relationships and missed opportunities that he understands clearly but can't fix because everyone is dead or estranged and time has run out. Shatner embodied the heroic captain who valued friendship and loyalty above all, who would risk everything for his crew, who believed in second chances and in the power of human connection to overcome any obstacle. But in his real life, William Shatner couldn't maintain those friendships, couldn't overcome his ego enough to preserve the relationships that mattered, couldn't become in reality the hero he played so convincingly on screen. That's the sadness of William Shatner at almost 96. Not that he failed to achieve success, but that success couldn't buy him the friendships, the family connections, the peace, or the contentment that should come with a life well lived. He's famous and accomplished and still working, but he's also alone, carrying regrets, outliving everyone who mattered, and frantically staying busy to avoid confronting what his life has actually been. He boldly went where no one had gone before on screen, but in real life he couldn't navigate the relationships and responsibilities that might have made his final years joyful instead of sad.